They caught him in a net. That was the part that stuck with Yael even after everything else, the sheer indignity of it. One moment he was moving through the ruins of what the Vreth called the Bone City, low and quiet, rifle strapped across his back, picking his way through collapsed towers that had once scraped clouds. The next, the ground lurched upward, and he was swinging 6 meters off the cracked earth, tangled in something that smelled like iron and old fur, and there were shapes moving in the shadows below. Big shapes. The kind that didn't need to hide. The Vreth were apes in the way that a thunderhead was a cloud, technically accurate and completely insufficient. They stood 2.5 meters at the shoulder, their forelimbs thick as ship pylons, their faces broad and flat and deeply intelligent in a way that made the intelligence feel like a threat. They wore armor that had been worked from salvaged spacecraft hull plating, etched with symbols Yael didn't recognize but understood instinctively as religious. Everything about them was religious. That was the problem. One of them looked up at him from below. It had pale eyes, almost white, and a scar that ran from its left temple to the corner of its jaw. It didn't say anything for a long moment. Then it said, in the trade tongue that had somehow survived the collapse better than most human languages, "You breathe wrong for a beast." Yael, still spinning slowly in the net, said, "You could let me down and we could discuss it properly." The pale-eyed one, he would learn its name was Golgan, did not smile. The Vreth didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in its expression, some small calculus of interest and contempt, and it said, "Yes, we could." They didn't let him down so much as drop him, and the others were already waiting at the bottom of the net when he hit the ground. Priya with her wrists bound behind her, blood on her temple, still managing to look like she was about to give someone a failing grade, and Soren, crouched with his knees drawn up to his chest, who had the particular stillness of a man who was working very hard not to show he was in pain. His left leg. The angle of it was wrong. "They got you too," Yael said. "Observant," Priya said. "As always." Soren made a short sound that might have been a laugh. 3 humans. That was what they were, all that remained of the survey team that had come to the Bone City looking for the relay station that might, possibly, still be broadcasting on the old emergency frequency. 3 humans in a city that no longer belonged to their kind, caught in the nets of something that had decided to make them part of a ceremony they didn't understand. Golgan spoke to the assembled Vreth in their own language, a deep percussive thing, all chest and resonance, and then turned back to the prisoners. "You will be tested," it said, "the trials of the Uruth Khan, to find which of you carries the soul of the first witness." "The first witness," Yael repeated, "the one who came before, the one who showed us that strength without mercy is rot, and mercy without strength is death. The one who walked among us and was not afraid, and not cruel." Golgan's pale eyes moved across all 3 of them. "One of you may be the witness returned. The trials will tell." "And if none of us are?" Priya asked. Golgan was quiet for a moment. "Then the trials still told us something," it said. They were taken deeper into the city, into a section where the old towers had partially collapsed inward, forming a kind of accidental amphitheater. Other Vreth were already gathered there, hundreds of them on the broken upper levels, and at the center of the space was a floor of cracked concrete with 3 distinct areas marked out in dried pigment. A dark circle, a long straight corridor of some kind, and a wide pit with a metal grate over it. There were others already in the space. Not Vreth, smaller creatures, rat-faced and wiry, who kept to the edges and watched with bright, calculating eyes. They wore scraps. They had not been given the dignity of having their wrists bound. The Vreth had simply herded them in, and they'd stayed because staying was safer than whatever was outside. When one of them scuttled too close to the pit, a Vreth guard didn't even look up before it extended one enormous arm and batted the creature back. Not hard, just firmly. The way you'd redirect livestock. "Vreth Keth," Soren murmured. He'd studied the territorial maps before the mission. He'd studied everything before the mission, which was part of why losing the use of his leg seemed to be hitting him harder than the actual capture. The Ratkin, Their client species, the Vreth, own the trade routes they move on. In exchange, the Ratkin do. He paused. I'm not sure what they do, actually. Whatever they're told, Priya said quietly. The first trial began without ceremony. One of the Ratkin, a male, young with notched ears, was shoved into the dark circle. There was a grinding sound from below. Then something came up through a grate in the center, a creature that Yael had no name for, all limbs and speed, with a mouth that seemed too large for its body and a chittering sound that was somehow both mechanical and organic. The Ratkin lasted 40 seconds. When it was done, Golgan looked at the three humans. The beast is hunger without thought. The first witness subdued it without killing it. This is the first trial. She was already looking at him. I can't run, Soren, Sued. His voice was flat and factual. You two go, don't, Yael said. I'm telling you, I heard you, I'm telling you no. Soren was quiet. The Vreth were watching. The thing in the circle circled the perimeter of the dark ring, mouth working, head swiveling. Yael went in first. The creature came for him immediately, and he let it get close, tracked its rhythm, the way it favored its left side, the way its eye stalk swiveled before it lunged. He'd grown up learning to read animals that had no reason to be read. He'd grown up in a world that had spent the last 2 generations trying to figure out how to live next to things that had decided, in the collapse's aftermath, that the old hierarchy was worth reconsidering. He'd grown up learning to negotiate. When the creature lunged, he went sideways instead of back and put his hands on either side of its neck casing. Not a choke, just pressure, precise pressure at the joint, and held on while it thrashed, and kept holding, and spoke to it in a low, steady voice that said nothing intelligible but communicated something anyway, some frequency of calm that went below language, because he'd learned a long time ago that calm was contagious, that it was one of the few things that crossed species without losing anything in translation. The creature slowed, then it stopped. He sat with his hands on its neck, and it breathed, or whatever it did that approximated breathing, and it watched him with its eye stalks and didn't try to kill him again. He walked it to the edge of the circle and stepped out. After a moment, the creature followed to the edge, stopped at the boundary of the dark ring like it understood the geometry of the situation, and sat. From above, from the tiers of broken concrete where the Vreth had gathered, there was silence. Then something that wasn't quite sound, more like a collective exhalation, hundreds of massive bodies adjusting their weight. Golgan was looking at him differently. The second trial was the corridor. It was long and narrow, and from the marks on the walls, acid, and old burns, it had been used before. At the far end was a door, and on the other side of the door was the next section of the compound, and if you could reach the door, you'd pass the trial. Simple enough. Except the corridor wasn't empty, and what was in it was a mist that smelled of copper and something else, something that made Yael's eyes water immediately on entry. Priya recognized it first. She'd been a xenobiochemist before the collapse reshaped what expertise the world needed, and she'd had to become other things, harder things. But the knowledge was still there, settled into her like sediment. Contact corrosive, she said, low and fast. Reacts with metal faster than organic. Don't touch the walls. She looked at Soren, at his leg. The brace. The brace was titanium composite. Standard medkit issue. Without it, Soren couldn't walk. Soren reached down and unclipped it. I can hop, he said, before anyone could argue. I've had worse, he probably had. None of them asked. They went through the corridor in a chain. Priya at the front, reading the drift of the mist, calling adjustments, Yael at the back with Soren's weight half distributed onto his shoulder. Soren moved with his jaw set and his eyes forward and didn't make a sound. And Yael could feel, in the tension of every joint between them, could feel what it cost to be that quiet, and did not say anything about it, because sometimes the most human thing you could offer someone was the dignity of their own silence. The door opened. The brace was gone, dissolved somewhere in the middle of the corridor. Soren had a piece of their supply line rope knotted around his knee, below the break, doing about 15% of what the brace had done, and none of what the pain medication would have done, had any of them had pain medication. "Next one," he said, and straightened. Golgan was waiting in the next chamber. It had been watching through some arrangement of mirrors or lenses embedded in the corridor walls. Its pale eyes moved from Soren's leg to Yael's face and held there. The second trial was not about the acid, it said. "I know," Yael said. "Many have sent their companions ahead. Left them at the entrance. It is practical." "It's practical," Yael agreed. We don't do practical when it costs something we can't pay back." Golgan was quiet for a moment. Then, one more trial, the pit. The grate had been removed. The pit was deep, 10, 12 meters, and at the bottom of it was something that Yael could hear but not see, something large and slow-moving and ancient, with breath like a bellows and a smell that was all musk and old hunger. The ratkin who'd been pushed close to it earlier had known what it was. They'd retreated to the far wall and they were still there, watching. "The Kethra," Golgan said. "It was here before the collapse, before us. It does not think as we think. It knows only the old appetites." A pause. 3 others have attempted this trial. They did not. "What do you need us to do?" Priya said. Golgan looked at her, then at Yael, then at Soren, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his face perfectly neutral. A man who had made the calculus and arrived at an answer and was waiting for someone to give him permission to implement it. "The first witness," Golgan said, "once entered the pit alone and emerged with the Kethra calm." "That's the trial," Yael said. "Enter the pit. Yes, alone." Golgan's pale eyes didn't waver. "The first witness was alone, so the trial is alone." Yael stood at the edge of the pit. He looked down into the dark and listened to the breathing of the thing at the bottom. He thought about the first trial, about the creature in the circle and the specific quality of its attention, when the pressure had been exactly right. He thought about the fact that the Vreth's god, this first witness, had done it before him, had stood at this same edge, or something like it, and chosen to go down. He thought about what kind of being would have that as their essential quality. Not strength, not invulnerability, but the specific willingness to go down into the dark and come back out without having become the darkness. He'd been human all his life, without particularly thinking about what that meant. The collapse had given him a lot of time to think about it. What had survived? Not the structures, not the hierarchies, not the great systems of organization that had been supposed to last forever. What survived was the specific and stubborn refusal to leave people behind. The ability to read things that didn't speak your language and find the common frequency. The capacity to go toward rather than away. Not because you weren't afraid, but because you'd figured out that fear was information rather than instruction. He lowered himself over the edge. The descent was slow, handhold by handhold on the rough stone, the darkness coming up to meet him, the smell thickening. His hands were steady. He focused on that, the steadiness of his hands, the breathing of the thing below. When his feet touched the floor of the pit, he stood still and let his eyes adjust. The Kethra was enormous. It filled most of the floor space, a mass of age and muscle, and something almost geological in its patience. It had been here before the Vreth had organized themselves into a cult. Before the collapse had remade the world's hierarchies, it was watching him with eyes that picked up the faint light from above and held it, amber and deep. He didn't move toward it. He didn't move away. He stood and breathed and let it know he was there. A long time passed. He hummed something his grandmother had taught him. A song that technically had words, but that he'd always experienced primarily as a shape. A particular pattern of sound that she'd said came from her grandmother's grandmother, from before all the things that had remade the world, from some older continuity that the world had not quite managed to erase. He wasn't sure why he did it. It felt like the right thing, like the specific texture of a real moment rather than a performed one. The Kethra's breathing changed. Slowed. Its head lowered, not in submission exactly, more like an easing, like something that had been held taut for a very long time finding the first edge of rest. He put his hand on its flank, left it there, felt the breath moving in and out, the heat of something ancient and alive. Then he climbed back out. When his hands came over the edge of the pit and he pulled himself up, the chamber was silent. Every breath on every broken tier, every ratkin along every wall. And Priya and Soren, who were watching him with expressions that they were doing their best to keep professional and were not entirely succeeding at. Golgan stood before him. The pale eyes were different now, not softer exactly, but more present. "You are not the first witness," Golgan said. "It was not an accusation, it was an observation." "No," Yale agreed, "but you know what the witness was." I think Golgan was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the assembled Vreth were still, the deliberate quiet of a species that understood ceremony. "The first witness came to us long ago," Golgan said finally. "Before the great silence, before the collapse remade the world. It was a being of enormous power, strength that could break stone, endurance beyond reckoning. And yet when the Vreth of that age found it, it was not using its strength against us. It was carrying one of our young, injured, back toward our territory. 3 days' walk. It did not know our language. We did not know its nature. But it brought our young back to us, and when our warriors surrounded it, ready, because we are always ready, it stood its ground, and it was not afraid, and it did not become cruel because of our fear." Yael thought about the corridors of the bone city, the way the old towers had partially collapsed, but the bones of them were still there, and what kinds of structures could leave bones that long after everything else was gone. "What was its name?" he asked. Golgan said a word in the Vreth language, then translated, "The first witness, the mighty one. We have many names for it, in its own tongue." And here Golgan said a word that Yael recognized, a word scratched into 100 pieces of pre-collapse salvage, a name carved into the foundations of towers that had survived things that should have been unsurvivable. The world rearranged itself slightly. "You've been looking for a return of something that was already a return," Yael said slowly. "The first witness was already looking for something when it came here. It already knew how to go toward instead of away. That wasn't power. It thought power was for this, for carrying the injured back home." Golgan's pale eyes held him. "We have searched for the witness for many generations," it said. "We have put many through the trials. Most failed the first. Some failed the second. A few have reached the third." It paused. "None have returned from the pit calm." "What did they do, the ones who reached the pit?" "Some descended and fought. The Kethra could not be fought." A longer pause. "Some descended and tried to command it. The Kethra does not take commands. Something shifted in Golgan's expression. Some descended and were simply still. They were not harmed, but they did not return calm. They returned afraid and quiet and still afraid. And me? You returned different from afraid." Golgan tilted its great head. "You returned the way the witness looked in the old records, like something that has made a decision about what it is and has decided it is enough." Priya made a small sound beside him. He didn't look at her because he thought if he looked at her right now, he might not be able to maintain the very carefully assembled composure he was currently operating on. "I need to ask you something," Yael said. "You have survived the trials." "I need to ask you anyway." He met the pale eyes. "The relay station, the one broadcasting on the old emergency frequency. We came here for it. There are people, our people, humans, who are isolated, cut off. Some of them have been alive for 2 years without knowing there are others, without knowing the collapse didn't take everyone." He held Golgan's gaze. "Do you know where it is?" The Vreth around them were very still. Golgan looked at him for a long time. Then it turned and spoke to the assembled Vreth in the deep percussive tongue, and the sound of it moved through the space like something physical, and the assembled Vreth responded, not with words, but with the collective sound of a group reaching a decision. Golgan turned back. "The station is in the deep sublevels," it said. "Our young ones have explored there. We know where it is." A pause. "We did not know its purpose. Will you show us?" Another long silence. The first witness said, "Carried our young home 3 days. Through territory it did not know, carrying a weight it had no obligation to carry. The pale eyes were steady. "We will show you the station, and we will escort you out of the Bone City. And a breath, and if your people need passage through Vreth territory while they are finding their way to each other, we will consider the terms." "That's all I'm asking," Yael said. "No," Golgan said, with something almost like amusement. "That is considerably more than you were asking. But it is what you needed." They left 3 hours later, at what the Vreth considered the best hour for travel. Not dawn as a human might choose, but the exact moment of maximum thermal contrast between the surface and the sublevels, when the air moved in predictable patterns and the creatures that hunted in the Bone City were between feeding cycles. Golgan had explained this with the same tone one might use to explain something obvious to someone who had somehow never encountered it before, which was, Yael supposed, accurate. Soren was moving on a Vreth-made crutch, something that had been assembled from salvage in about 40 minutes by a craft worker who had watched his existing improvised arrangement with visible professional offense. It was better than anything they could have made. The craft worker had also, without being asked, added a carved detail to the top of the crutch, small, almost geometric, the kind of mark that Yael was starting to recognize as a Vreth honorific. He didn't mention it, but he saw Soren run his thumb across it when he thought no one was looking. The relay station was real. It was in the sublevels where Golgan had said it would be, and it was damaged but not dead, and Priya spent 40 minutes lying on her back under the primary transmitter array with a power cell she'd sourced from the Vreth's own salvage stores, traded, not taken, which had involved a longer negotiation than any of them had expected, and ended with a cultural exchange of informations about pre-collapse music that Yael suspected would have lasting effects on Vreth ceremonial practice. And then the station hummed and the signal went out, strong and clean and on every frequency that anyone who'd learned to listen would recognize. They sat in the sublevel and listened to it broadcast and didn't say much, because there wasn't much that needed to be said. Sometimes things that have been lost for a long time find their way back, and the finding is its own kind of complete. Golgan stood at the entrance to the sublevel and watched them. Its pale eyes moved from the transmitter to Yael, and in them was an expression that he was starting to learn to read in the way he'd learned to read other things, the expression that meant something was being added to the internal record, filed under something important. "The witness carried the injured home," Golgan said. "It could not have known we would remember it. It could not have known we would build something around what it showed us." A pause. "It did not carry our young back because of what we would do with the memory. It did it because it had decided what it was." "Yeah," Yael said. "What had it decided?" He thought about the pit, about the Kethra's breathing in the dark, about his grandmother's song, which had no origin anyone could quite trace, which had survived every catastrophe the world had offered it by being passed from person to person, hand to hand, the way things that matter survive, not through infrastructure but through stubbornness, through the specific human refusal to let what matters dissolve. "That power is for carrying things," he said, "not for putting things down." Golgan was quiet. Then it made a sound deep in its chest, not a word exactly, a note. And from above, from the levels where the assembled Vreth had waited, the note came back. Hundreds of voices, the same frequency, the sound of a species that had kept something alive for generations and was now perhaps understanding a little more about what they'd kept. Yael sat next to Priya and Soren and listened to the relay station transmit into the dark and thought about the being the Vreth had named the first witness, who had walked into spaces that should have been dangerous and come out without having become dangerous, who had carried the wounded home through territory that wasn't theirs, who had stood still in the face of things that could have destroyed them, and had been, somehow, the calming element rather than the frightened one, and thought, yes, that sounds right. That sounds like something worth being descended from. The signal reached, as signals do, further than anyone expected. By the third day, there were responses.